Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased that you've decided to join me to take a look at U.S. history. We try to take a look at U.S. history from a variety of different angles, try to identify the story behind the story. Sometimes we try to look at the odd things that have happened, and certainly examine the personalities that have made the American experience so unique in all the history of the world. In particular, we take a look at the U.S. Constitution, this wonderful document that has governed this country for well over 200 years. And we try to understand some of the complications and some of the problems that we face as a nation, day by day, year by year, month by month. In any event, I hope you're enjoying this and that you come back often, because I will keep repeating these and posting them to YouTube so that you can relive the experience if you want to do it more than once. And I hope you do. Anyway, welcome and enjoy the presentations. Some of the background to authoritarianism and to demagogues and so forth, and laid the groundwork for what I call a threat to democracy. And I've really done some of this in the past in a little bit of a different way. And so you may see a few things that are repeated here, but it's stuff that I think needs to be repeated. So today we're taking on a version called, or I'm calling it, Is Trumpism a Cult? Is Trumpism a cult? And more importantly, does it matter? And will this eventually lead, or are we already there, having minority rule in our country? So, a little semantics to clarify beyond what I did last time. First of all, I don't want to demean being a Republican. I spent most of my life being a Republican. It's a perfectly honorable thing to be, as a counterpoint to more liberal views in our society. And so this is not intended to be anti-Republican, even though I will be saying some negative things about the Republican Party as it is currently being led and constituted. I also am not going to be castigating generally conservatism. Conservatism is a legitimate political view of how to approach public affairs. And so I'm not intending to do that, although it could be implied by the time I'm done that that's my intent. I'm also going to be saying some things about religion that will sort of be able to, you can interpret them as being anti-religion. No, I'm not anti-religion. I think faith is an important part of everyone's life, whatever particular faith you choose to pursue. I'm also not demeaning being white. It's perfectly fine to be white in your particular background. And so that's not my purpose in what I'm doing. And I am not demeaning things that come out of the South, although you can interpret some of the things I will say as being anti-people from the old South or the new South, as the case may be. So let's start off by defining what is a cult. And there are thousands of cults in America. Some are harmless and some that can be very dangerous. It can be defined that a cult is a group or movement held together by a shared commitment, generally to a charismatic leader or a charismatic ideology, not necessarily a person. It's a belief system that has the answers to all of life's questions and offers a special solution to be gained only by following the leader's rules. And people are very desperate and lonely in our society. They want answers. It requires a high level of commitment from at least some of the members. Many cult-like activities would be things like astrology, demon worship and consultation, fortune telling, horoscopes, spells, tarot cards, voodoo, witchcraft, Satanism, palmistry, or necromancer, worshiping the dead. And I have to admit that I look at my horoscope. I don't attach a whole lot of importance to it, but it's interesting. I've had my palm read, and I think it's kind of interesting because it tells me I'm probably going to live a long life, which I guess you can say I already have. But I don't subscribe as a member of those particular cults. Largely, cultism in our society today is a cultic view of Jesus or of religion. It can be said by some that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, or the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Unification Church, the Moonies, the Worldwide Church of God, the Armstrongites, the Way International, the Unitarian Church, Mayan sciences like Christian Science, religious science, unity, philosophy. All of those could be considered to be somewhat cultic. So who can be targeted? Who joins who joins cults? Well, it might be young people. It could be the intelligent, the articulate, the family, old people, especially those with money, healthy people, those who are dependent, unassertive, or people who have a low tolerance for ambiguity, people who are idealistic or have a strong desire for spiritual meaning, an impaired ability to criticize what one is told or hears. Now, what does this tell you? Anybody can join a cult. Many of us are in cults. Could it be said that Prime Gentleman is a cult? Well, up to you to decide that or not. The belief that it would never happen to me is wrong, because it can happen to you, and you do belong probably to something that someone would call a cult. Other examples of some of the more egregious ones, perhaps you remember from the news, 1978, Reverend Jim Jones, he had 900 followers. They went into Guyana and they drank cyanide-laced punch, and 900 of them commit suicide. A Mexican religious cult in 1991, 29 followers suffocate after he instructed them to keep and ignore toxic fumes filling the church. Other examples, we all remember David Koresh, where 80 Branch Davidians near Waco, Texas, were in a fire and a shootout, and they died. 1993, 53 Vietnamese tribal villagers commit suicide with primitive weapons. They believe they will go straight to heaven as a result of it. The restoration of the 10 Commandments in Uganda. More than 235 women and children died in an apparent mass suicide. Some estimate it could have been 470 or so. The followers locked themselves in their church, doused themselves in gasoline, and set themselves ablaze. Hard to believe that people do that, but they do. It's been around in Uganda since the late 1980s. Another one, the Order of the Solar Temple in Switzerland, 1994, 67 members are under the control of this Joseph de Mambre, are found burned to death in the French Alps, Switzerland, and in Quebec. A year later, he's gone. Remaining members of the cult committed another mass suicide. And then this guy, Supreme Truth Shoko Ashara, 1995. So Ashara on the Supreme Truth released sarin gas in 5 Tokyo subway stations, killing 12, one dying a year later after the attack and sickening more than 5,500 others. He had about 10,000 people who followed him, believing that their leader had the ability to levitate and that the end of the world would come in the year 2000. Well, didn't quite work out that way, did it? Ashara was captured and sentenced to death, which is not unusual. It's not usual in Japan. Heaven's Gate, remember this, sweetheart? 1997, 39 members of Heaven's Gate cult led by Marshall Applewhite committed suicide. The comet Hale-Bopp was passing Earth at that time, and they used mixtures of phenobarbital applesauce and vodka. They put plastic bags over their head to be sure of asphyxiating. The idea was to die so his spirit would ascend to the UFO following Hale-Bopp, which would then take him and his followers to another plane, both physical and spiritual. Spooky looking to begin with. A couple more to go here. 2000 in Africa, Christian Doomsday. More than 900 members of a reclusive Christian Doomsday cult were murdered by their leaders. Many burned to death, others were buried in mass graves. And one more here, the Raelian Church, a cult founded by Claude Vorilhon, known as Rael. They believed in human cloning, and they cloned 2 or more infants, and they were baptized into their church, and they believed in free love. They preached a sensual philosophy and a physicalitist explanation of the origin of life. And it could have been that there were as many as 65,000 members of this cult. I mean, it's not like just something around the corner. This was big. And so the omnipresence of cults and cult activities Some have estimated there are over 5,000 cults in the US alone, including militia groups, extremist religions, and New Age sects. The new millennium rekindled interest and membership in cults. Some estimates estimate upwards of 185,000 converts per year. Not all cults. Not all cults are religious or spiritual in nature. Modern cults include large group awareness training, psychotherapy, business, political, and New Age groups, or maybe prime gentlemen. Now, there's a different. Come on, gone too fast here. Finger happy here. So there is trouble with defining what is a cult. I just have a list of things here. You can decide, yeah, I think that one's a cult, like maybe the Unification Church with the Moonies. But I don't know. I don't think that being a Mason or a Shriner is a cult. Well, maybe it is, and maybe it isn't. How about belonging to a fraternity or sorority in college? Is that a cult? How about Amway? When you sell Amway product, have you joined a cult? How about the Boy Scouts of America? Well, you see, there are many ways you can look at what is a cult. Because people get pretty passionate about these things that they believe in and they care about. Some sociological characteristics. Now I want you to stop in your mind, because you've been paying attention to the news over the past 6-7 years. And I want you to think about Donald Trump as I go through these particular items, and ask yourself and test for yourself, are these characteristics that belong to him in some way or shape or form? First of all, authoritarianism is very omnipresent in all cults. Even the enlightened ones have that as a factor. An elitist mentality. They believe because they belong to this cult, they're better than everybody else. They tend to be isolationists. They tend to retreat into the cult and stay away from other people. Closed-mindedness. Legalistic lifestyle. They have rules to follow, and they follow the rules, and they make the other members of the cult follow it as well. Difficult to exit. Once you're in, boy, it's hard to get out sometimes. Oppositional. Subjective, not rational, in other words. Persecution conscious. Somebody's out to get them. Sanction oriented. Esoteric, mysterious, private. They have secrets that nobody else can know. Anti-sacerdotal. They don't, life in the cults is marked by fear of judgment, pressure, and legalism. This is very different from what we're taught in the Holy Bible. Now, this is a great researcher. His name is Stephen Hassan, and he has written a really great piece of work. He's one of the prime researchers of this area. And he was induced into a cult when he was young. And so he comes from that perspective, and then an academic thing. And he's developed something he calls the BITE model. What BITE stands for: behavior, information, thought, emotion, and emotional control. And he identifies that it ranges from constructive, a cult can be constructive, to destructive. And so for individuals, he says that you can have the authentic self as opposed to false cult identity. Unconditional love as compared to conditional love. Compassion, hate. Conscience, doctrine. Creative and humor, solemnity, fear and guilt. Free will and critical thinking, dependency and obedience. Now, when we take a look at the leaders of cults, psychologically healthy, probably the Boy Scouts would fit in that category. Narcissistic and psychopathic. Health knows their own limits. Elitist, grandiose. Empowers individuals. Power hungry. Trustworthy. Secretive, deceptive. Claims absolute authority. And then for organizations, relationships. Egalitarianism is versus elitism. Checks and balances versus authoritarian nature. Informed consent is versus deceptive and manipulative. Individuality, diversity, clones people. Means create end. Ends justify the means. Encourages growth. preserves their own power. No legitimate free to leave or no legitimate reason to leave. So these is his analysis of what cults are all about. Now, especially pay attention to this when we talk about our former president who in a cult leader profile. There is a factor, there is a guide called the Goldwater Rule that professional psychoanalysts engage in, and it was an attack on Barry Goldwater back in the 1960s, in which he prevailed, and the Psychological Association adopted a rule that's loosely known as the Goldwater Rule, and it says, "Thou shalt not diagnose or explain psychological behavior unless you're treating the person professionally." However, there are lots of people who don't subscribe to that, and they are professional analysts, and they have written about Donald Trump's psychosis. And they've described him as, and describe others as, a phenomenon called malignant narcissism. Grandiose, self-centered behavior. See if these fit when we talk about Donald Trump. Fantasies of power, successes, and attractiveness. Need for praise and admiration. Sense of entitlement. A lack of empathy. Antisocial behavior. Lying. Interpersonally exploitive. Sadism. Harassment and silencing. Violence. Paranoia. And the inability to trust friends and subordinates, even allies plus enemies, even no trust for anyone. Okay, so now having said that, what difference does it make? Donald Trump was just a business executive, a blowhard. He was running his real estate business for a long time. He got to be in his mid-70s. And frankly, I'm one of those people who never paid a whole lot of attention to him. And then all of a sudden, he's there, this phenomenon that becomes elected president, and he's still governing and influencing and so forth. Now, why? How did that become possible? Because there was fertile ground, and I'm going to talk about the fertile ground for him to move into. It was not, the problem in the US is not caused by Donald Trump. Donald Trump is simply a man who was able to capitalize on a situation that was already developing or existing. Now, I start off by talking about the guardrails. For most of the 20th century, America's guardrails have been solid. There were many occasional assaults on democratic norms. For example, McCarthyism in the 1950s, which 2 weeks ago we talked about somewhat extensively. Both parties broadly engaged in mutual tolerance and forbearance. Those are two key terms: mutual tolerance and forbearance, which allowed our system of checks and balances to work. During the first 3/4 of the 20th century, there were no impeachments or successful instances of court packing. Senators were judicious in their use of filibusters and their right to advise and consent on presidential appointments. Most Supreme Court nominees were approved easily, even when the president's party didn't control the Senate. And outside of wartime, presidents themselves largely refrained from acting unilaterally to circumvent Congress or the courts. A legacy of it working. For more than a century, America's system of checks and balances worked. The system worked because it was reinforced by these strong norms of mutual toleration and forbearance. There is, however, an important tragedy at the heart of this story. The soft guardrails that undergirded America's 20th century democracy were built upon racial exclusion and operated in a political community that was overwhelmingly white and Christian. Efforts to create a multiracial democracy after the Civil War generated violent resistance, especially in the South. Southern Democrats viewed Reconstruction as an existential threat, and they used both constitutional hardball and outright violence to resist it. Only after the Republicans abandoned Reconstruction in 1877, enabling the Democrats to establish Jim Crow in the South. The Democrats ceased to view their rivals as existential threat, and the two parties began to peacefully coexist, allowing norms of mutual toleration and forbearance to emerge. In other words, it was only after racial equality was removed from the agenda, restricting America's political community to white people, that these norms took hold. And they lasted until 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 finally made America more of a democracy. The fact that our guardrails emerged in an area of incomplete democracy has important consequences for the contemporary polarization that we have. Early signs of the problem. There were early signs of the 1990s when Newt Gingrich encouraged his fellow Republicans to use words like betray, anti-flag, and traitor to describe Democrats. In doing so, Gingrich encouraged Republicans to overtly abandon mutual toleration. The Gingrich Revolution also brought a rise in constitutional hardball, including the first major government shutdown in 1995. We've forgotten these things, by the way, and presidential impeachment, and the first in 130 years in 1998. So who were some of them involved? The erosion of democratic norms accelerated during the Obama presidency. Republican leaders like Gingrich, Sarah Palin, Rudy Giuliani, Mike Huckabee, and Donald Trump told their followers that President Obama did not love America and that Obama and the Democrats were not real Americans. Trump and others even questioned whether President Obama was an American citizen. Hillary Clinton received similar treatment. Trump and other Republican figures cast her as a criminal, making "lock her up" a chant at rallies. And which rally was this really significant? It didn't happen on the political fringes. And these were ideas put forth by the Republican nominee for president, cheered live on national television by the crowd at the Republican National Convention. The growing cancer was a worrisome development because when mutual toleration disappears, politicians begin to abandon forbearance. When we view our partisan rivals as enemies or an existential threat, we grow tempted to use any means to stop them, any means necessary to stop them. What exactly has happened over the last decade? Republicans in Congress treated the Obama administration as an existential threat that had to be defeated at almost any cost. Constitutional hardball became the norm. There were more filibusters during President Obama's second term than in all the years between World War I and Ronald Reagan's second term combined. Congress twice shut down the government, and at one point it pushed the country to the brink of default. Obama responded with constitutional hardball of his own. When Congress refused to pass immigration reform or climate change legislation, he circumvented Congress through executive orders. While technically legal, they violated the spirit of the Constitution. The most consequential act of constitutional hardball during the Obama years was a Senate refusal to even take up and discuss President Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court. Since 1866, every time a president had an opportunity to fill a court vacancy before the election of a successor, he had been allowed to do so, although sometimes he had to try twice. The Senate's refusal to even consider an Obama nominee thus violated a 150-year-old norm. The problem then is not that Americans elected a demagogue in 2016. It's that we elected a demagogue at a time when the soft guardrails protecting our democracy were coming on board. Trump simply slipped in as the leader of a situation that was already in place. It could have been somebody else, I suppose, but we're so obsessed with him that it's hard to imagine who it would be. The driving force behind democratic norm erosion is polarization. Over the past 25 years, Republicans and Democrats have come to fear and loathe each other. In a 1960s survey, 4% of Democrats and 5% of Republicans said they would be displeased if their child married someone from the other party. 50 years later, a survey found those numbers to be 33% and 49%. According to a 2016 Pew survey, 49% of Republicans and 55% of Democrats said the other party makes them afraid. And one of my neighbors catch me on the street while I was walking my dogs a day or two ago, and he said, I'm just terrified of what's happening. I'm just shuddering in my boots at what's happening in our society. A recent study shows that about 60% of both Democrats and Republicans believe the other party is a serious threat to the United States. And we haven't seen this kind of partisanship since the 19th century, in the events leading up to the Civil War. Some polarization is normal, even healthy in a democracy, but extreme polarization can kill it. When societies are highly polarized, we become more willing to tolerate undemocratic behavior by our own side. When politics is so polarized that we view a victory by our partisan rivals as something that's catastrophic, we justify violence, election fraud, and coups. Partisan rivals came to view one another as such an existential threat that they chose to subvert democracy rather than accept victory by the other side. Where did it come from? We're experiencing today is not traditional liberal conservative polarization. People do not fear and loathe one another over taxes or healthcare policy. Contemporary partisan divisions run deeper than that. They are about racial and cultural identity. The stability of modern American democracy rested to a significant extent on racial exclusion. Our democratic norms were erected by and for a political community that was overwhelmingly white and Christian, and which forcibly excluded millions of African Americans in the South until 1964. Due to large-scale immigration and steps towards racial equality, our country is both more diverse and more democratic. These changes have eroded both the size and the social status of America's white Christian majority. In the 1950s, when many of us were kids, white Christians were over 90% of American voters. In 1992, 73% of American voters were white Christians. In 2012, that percentage fell to 57% and will be below 50% by 2024. White Christians are losing their electoral majority. White Christians are losing their dominant social status. White Christian men sat atop all of our country's social, economic, political, and cultural hierarchies in the past. They filled the presidency. No women to this date have been presidents. Filled the Congress. It was rare to see a woman in there. It was almost a huge event when there was a woman who elected. The Supreme Court didn't have women on it until until Ronald Reagan had nominated one. And the governor's mansions, almost all men. They were the CEOs, the newscasters, and most of the leading celebrities and scientific authorities. And they were the face of both major political parties. Those days are over. Losing one's dominant social status can be deeply threatening. Many white Christian men feel like the country they grew up in is being taken away from them. For many people, that feels like an existential threat. And so when somebody says, "Make America great again," the great was back in 1950, when we had the South safely boxed up. All those African Americans were not a threat and so forth, and the white Christians were in charge. That's what the Make America Great is. Three major changes have occurred over the last half century. First, the civil rights movement led to a massive migration of Southern white people from the Democrats to the Republicans, happened largely during Franklin Roosevelt's time, while African Americans newly enfranchised in the South became overwhelmingly Democratic. Second, the United States experienced a massive wave of immigration, and most of those immigrants ended up in the Democratic Party. And third, beginning with Ronald Reagan's presidency in the early 1980s, white evangelical Christians flocked to the Republicans. They had not played much of a role in politics, at least directly, as organizations. The Democrats represent a rainbow coalition that includes urban and educated white voters and people of color. Nearly half of Democratic voters are non-white. The Republicans, by contrast, remain overwhelmingly white and Christian, 73%. Americans have thus sorted themselves into parties that represent racially different communities, social identities, and visions of what America is and should be. Republicans increasingly represent white Christian America, whereas the Democrats have come to represent pretty much everybody else. This is the divide that underlies our country's deep polarization, and it's very dangerous because you have to have two viable parties that are considered to be roughly equal, and that is not the case right now. Because that one is sinking, well, I'll touch it here in a minute. The Democratic base is diverse and expanding. The Republican Party represents a once dominant majority in numerical status decline, numerical and status decline. Sensing this decline, many Republicans have grown fearful about the future. Slogans like "Take our country back" and "Make America great again" reflect this sense of peril. These fears, moreover, have fueled a troubling development that threatens our democracy, a growing Republican aversion to losing elections. So a democracy requires that parties know how to lose. Politicians who lose elections must accept defeat, go home, and play again the next day. Without this norm of gracious losing, democracy is not sustainable. For parties to accept losing, however, two conditions must hold. First, they must feel secure that losing today will not bring ruthless consequences. And secondly, they must believe they have a reasonable chance of winning again in the future. When party leaders fear they cannot win future elections or that their defeat proposes an existential threat to themselves or their constituents, the stakes rise. Their time horizons shorten. They throw tomorrow to the wind and seek to win at any cost today. In other words, desperation leads politicians to play dirty. So, Southern Democrats reacted in a similar manner to the Reconstruction era enfranchisement of the African Americans mandated by the 15th Amendment. Since African Americans represented a majority, or at least a near majority, in most post-Confederate states, their enfranchisement imperiled Southern Democrats' political dominance and threatened the entire racial order. Viewing Black people's enfranchisement as an existential threat, Southern Democrats played dirty. Between 1885 and 1908, all 11 post-Confederate states passed laws establishing poll taxes, literacy tests, property and residency requirements, and other measures aimed at stripping African Americans of their voting rights and locking in Democratic dominance, Democratic Party dominance. These measures, together with a monstrous campaign of anti-Black violence, did what they were intended to do. Black voter turnout in the South fell from 61% in 1880 to just 2% in 1912. Unwilling to lose, Southern Democrats stripped the right to vote from almost half the population, ushering in nearly a century of authoritarianism in the South. The GOP is showing signs of a similar panic today. Republican electoral prospects are diminishing. They remain overwhelmingly an overwhelmingly white Christian party in an increasingly diverse society. Moreover, younger voters are deserting them. In 2018, people ages 18 to 29 voted Democrat by more than 2 to 1, and those in their 30s, nearly 60% Democrat. Demography, not destiny, as California Republicans learned after adopting a hardline anti-immigrant stance in the 1990s, can punish parties that resist societal change. The growing diversity of America's electorate has made it harder for the Republican Party to win national majorities. Indeed, the GOP, the Republicans, have won the popular vote in just one presidential election in the last 30 years. That was 1964, the second term of George W. Bush, and it was not a large margin.
94.
I'm sorry, did I? 2004.
2004.
2004. Sorry, my tongue sometimes misspeaks. No party likes to lose, but for a Republican, the party is magnified by the perception that among the base, that defeat will have catastrophic consequences. White Christian Republicans fear they're on the brink of losing not just elections, but their country. So like old Southern Democrats, they've begun to play dirty, dimming electoral horizons and growing perceptions of an existential threat have encouraged a win now at any cost mentality. Mentality has been most manifest in recent efforts to tilt the electoral playing field. Since 2010, a dozen Republican-led states have adopted new laws making it more difficult to register or vote. Republican state and local governments have closed polling places in predominantly African-American neighborhoods, purged voter rolls, and created new obstacles to registration and voting. In Georgia in 2017, an exact match law allowed authorities to throw out voter registration forms whose information did not exactly match existing records. During Georgia's 2018 gubernatorial race, Brian Kemp, who was then the Secretary of State, and now its governor, used the law to invalidate tens of thousands of registration forms, mostly from African Americans. He also purged hundreds of thousands of votes from the rolls, although these initiatives are less egregious than Jim Crow, the underlying logic is similar. Parties representing fearful declining majorities resort in desperation to dirty politics. So where is democracy headed, American democracy? The Trump administration endangered American democracy like no other administration in modern history. American history. There are three potential threats: continued democratic backsliding, descent into dysfunction, and minority rule. So Trump has attacked the media, trampled on congressional oversight, and sought foreign intervention into our elections. He deployed the machinery of government for personal, partisan, and undemocratic ends. In the COVID-19 pandemic, the Trump administration used the U.S. Postal Service to make it harder to vote and to shape the results of the election. Across the government, officials responsible for law enforcement, national intelligence, defense, election security, the census, public health, and even weather forecasting were under pressure to work for the president's personal and political benefit and against his critics and opponents. Those who refused, including inspectors general responsible for the independently monitored government agencies, were pushed out and replaced with Trump loyalists. Democratic backsliding has been facilitated by the Republican Party. So you can't just blame the Democrats, which has repeatedly abdicated in the face of President Trump's violations of constitutional order. In the book, How Democracies Die in 2017, the authors expected a faction of the GOP, especially in the US Senate, to break with President Trump, helping to block or deter his most egregious abuses. These authors concluded that they were too optimistic. You never hear even a whimper of criticism of President Trump by the Republicans. In the context of extreme polarization, Republicans who confronted the party's radicalized base, such as Jeff Flake, saw their political careers derailed. Unwilling to risk their careers to defend democracy, House and Senate Republicans abdicated, undermining Congress's constitutional role as a check on executive power and imperiling our system of separation of powers. And Liz Cheney has found out what cost it is to oppose Donald Trump. This is how autocracies are built. Leaders transform law enforcement, intelligence, and other institutions into partisan weapons, which they use to shield themselves from investigation and in turn to investigate and punish critics. When the referees work for the incumbent, the political playing field is inevitably tilted, subverting democratic competition. Indeed, Trump's efforts to purge and corrupt government agencies closely mirrors those used by Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán to undermine his country's democracy. Extreme polarization. The erosion of our checks and balances was made clearer in the failure of the 2019-2020 impeachment process. Senate Republicans stated from the onset that they would acquit the president no matter what the evidence of wrongdoing. Polarization was so extreme that it was more important for the Republicans to beat the Democrats than to rein in a president who threatened democratic institutions. Impeachment, our most powerful constitutional check on executive abuse, was therefore rendered essentially toothless. Our democracy faces a descent into dysfunction. America's system of checks and balances only works with a degree of mutual toleration and forbearance. Remember those two words, two phrases. When polarization erodes norms and encourages constitutional hardball, divided government can easily descend into a kind of permanent institutional warfare, leaving the federal government unable to do the basic work of governance. Partisan minority rule is bad enough, but it has an even more dangerous corollary. Republicans, pushed by a fearful white Christian base into a win now at any cost mentality, may use their advantage in counter-majoritarian institutions to entrench themselves in power without winning electoral majorities. Indeed, in the face of enduring opposition majorities. The Electoral College permitted Donald Trump's election and could have permitted his re-election, while the Senate enabled his egregious abuse of power. Republican efforts to tilt the electoral playing field via gerrymandering, purging of voter rolls, and new obstacles to registration and voting have been largely upheld by the current Supreme Court. There's one very important North Carolina case that they have now taken up, would really make the decision whether the courts could play any role or if it all reverts back to the state legislature in each state to determine who won the electoral votes of that state. Minority rule. Consider the following facts. The last two Republican presidents came to office despite having lost the popular vote, and it could happen again. The Democrats easily won the overall vote in the 2016 and 2018 Senate elections, and yet Republicans still controlled the Senate. In 2017, Neil Gorsuch became the first Supreme Court justice in history to be appointed by a president who lost the popular vote and then be confirmed by senators who represented less than half of the country. Later, Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett ascended to the court in exactly the same way, creating a conservative court majority with decidedly minoritarian origins. In February 2020, the 52 senators who voted to acquit President Trump came from states that represented 18 million fewer Americans than the 48 senators who voted to convict. Minority rule does have a deep history in America. The Constitution, for one thing, is biased towards small or low population states. Over time, small state bias evolved into a massive overrepresentation of rural states, affecting three important counter-majoritarian institutions. The Electoral College is biased towards sparsely populated states. The U.S. Senate is heavily biased towards sparsely populated states. And because the Senate must approve Supreme Court nominations, the Supreme Court is also biased towards sparsely populated states. Population trends, the gradual depopulation of rural areas are exacerbating the problem. In 20 years, 70% of the US population will be living in 16 states, which means that 30% of the country will control 68% of the Senate. Minority rule. The rural bias inherent in the political system had little partisan effect because both major parties had urban and rural wings at one time. The system always favored Vermont over New York, but it did not favor any particular party. That's the change. Now US parties have divided upon urban and rural lines. Today, Democratic voters are concentrated in the big metropolitan centers, Republicans increasingly based in sparsely populated territories. That gives the GOP a systematic and growing advantage in the Electoral College, the Senate, and the Supreme Court. Democracy requires the existence of at least two democratically minded political parties. American democracy can only be secure when both major parties are committed to the democratic rules of the game. For that to happen, frankly, the Republican Party is going to have to change. It must transform itself into a more diverse party capable of attracting younger, urban, and non-white voters. The Republican Party can thrive in a multiracial America. A Republican Party will be less fearful for the future. Without the win now at any cost mentality of a party facing inexorable decline, Republicans will be more likely to embrace democratic norms. Such changes are less far-fetched than they may appear. Indeed, the Republican National Committee recommended them as recently as 2013. But the Republican transformation will not happen automatically. Parties only change course when their strategies fail. In democratic politics, success and failures are measured at the ballot box, and nothing compels change like electoral defeat. The only way out of this impasse is to double down on democracy, defending the right of all citizens to vote. Since the 1960s, the Americans have taken important steps toward the creation of something few societies have achieved, a truly multiracial democracy. Barack Obama's presidency, barely a generation after the end of Jim Crow, was an unmistakable sign of our democratic progress. These democratic achievements are worth defending, but they're now imperiled. It's a tragic paradox that our country's belated steps towards full democracy triggered the racial reaction that now threatens it. So what? Well, first of all, it's quite likely Republicans are going to do well in 10 or 12 days at the election. However, that doesn't change the underlying composition of things. And I am frankly ready to predict that in 2024, they will suffer massive defeats across the country. Because by then, first of all, they will, I just sensed that by then these other factors will have now come into play in a more certain kind of a way. But for right now, it isn't quite. So what? Well, so what is that the parties decided when they saw all of this happening, why don't we go out and find a malignant narcissist demagogue to lead us? And lo and behold, he happened to be there just when they needed him. And he has been able to make a huge impact and a continuing one. Albeit, I just saw Cohen was interviewed and reported in one of the publications I read this morning that he believes Trump will not run in 2024, and he knows him pretty well. And he believes that Trump will not endure the idea that he could lose again. And even though he did win the presidency because of the electoral vote, remember, he lost the election in terms of the popular vote. And so he knows in his own mind that he is a two-time loser, and he will not be willing to be a three-time loser. So we have much to lose. Americans are concerned about the threats facing our democracy, and they must participate in all the elections, but also commit themselves to protect our most basic democratic institutions, including the voting and civil rights. Will we do what is necessary? The stakes are high. We have much to lose. And so there we are. But, maybe this is just the beginning.